Today we'll be discussing the legendary band Bon Jovi.
Woohoo!
And we'll be discussing vocal cord injury. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asadoja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today we will be discussing the classic rock band Bon Jovi and the recent docuseries about the band called Thank You and Goodnight, which is available on Disney+. Now, in the series, Jon Bon Jovi is suffering from vocal cord issues, affecting his ability to hit those high notes, right, Ali? So in our second half, we're going to be discussing vocal cord injuries. A bit of trivia about this docuseries. It's pretty good. It's 4 parts. Well, I guess we can talk about it now. It's probably could have been 2 hours. It's 4 hours. It could have been like 2 hours. But it's made by a guy named Gotham Chopra.
Yeah.
Gotham, like Gotham City. But when I read that, I'm like, that's not your name, buddy. Okay? I know that's not your name. His real name is Ali.
Gotham, G-A-U-T-A-M, maybe Gotham, something like that. But anyway,
I think it's
you're
Gautam.
self-hating.
I don't think it's an ancient.
Gautam is how you pronounce it. Okay, so your self-hating brown side aside, because you can let this guy do whatever he wants.
True.
He's a multi-hyphenate, sports documentarian, entrepreneur, producer, podcast host, director, journalist, author, etc. His company is called Religion of Sports for our particular purposes here, and Religion of Sports produced this doc. And I also have some opinions about him. Guess who his father is, folks? His last name is Chopra. Who is his father? It's Deepak Chopra. And normally we love to be in a position where it can be like, not all brown people are related, okay? Not all brown people know each other. Unfortunately,
in this case, yes. His dad, super rich, health. He's an influencer, but we wouldn't call it back then in the day. So anyway, Nepo baby, I don't know. I like the documentary, but Ali has certainly some thoughts, which we'll talk about in a second.
Well, hold on. In fairness to Gotham, that's how I'm going to pronounce it. Here's what I know about this dude. Here's what I've since learned. He was working, first of all, let me just tell you this. He was working with Channel 1 News in LA. He found out that he was hired because one of the execs at Channel 1 was a fan of his father.
Right.
So that's not him using his father. He was hired because somebody, Yeah. Secondly, I think this is an important point. He was a war correspondent, stationed internationally. So you could have the most influential parent in the world, but war correspondent is some OG stuff that you're getting killed no matter who your parents are. You're putting your life at risk. So I don't know. Let's give this guy some respect, Asif. Also, a little bit of trivia. Arrested at Islamabad International Airport. When empty bullet shells were found in his bag, they were a gift from the Taliban who he had been interviewing in Pakistan.
I mean, the Taliban's like, what are we going to get this guy? I mean, oh my God, he's a famous war correspondent.
They probably thought he was a Nepo baby too.
He doesn't deserve anything.
His father can give him anything.
He deserves. Yeah, well, okay. All right. Okay, apologies to Gotham Chopra. Okay, Ali, let's get talking about Bon Jovi. We're going to talk mainly about lead singer Jon Bon Jovi, but we'll talk about the band in general. I think we'll give a bit of background and then maybe just talk about some trivia about his life, and then we can talk about the documentary, and then maybe finish off with the vocal cord issues that are plaguing him to this very day. He grew up, Jon Bon Jovi, in New Jersey. He got interested in music in high school, and a bunch of early bands, the Atlantic City Expressway, Jon Bon Jovi and the Wild Ones was his band, because that's his real name, Jon Bon Jovi.
Bon Jovi from Sicily, Sicilian father, or half Sicilian father, yeah.
The Rest was the name of another one of his bands. And I didn't know this, he was really making a name for himself on like the New Jersey, the Jersey Shore, where all these bands were playing in kind of the late 70s and early 80s, right?
Actually, one of the most interesting things I thought, more than his early bands, were his early influences. So there's this sort of legendary character, Southside Johnny, and it's Southside Johnny and the Ashbury Jukes, I think was his band. And anyone who sort of grew up in that area in Jersey would know about them. They traveled up and down Jersey. I'm sure they got out of Jersey as well. They played a little bit of his style, and he was talking about how he was a guy who realized you can play black music, you can sing black music, quote unquote, with your own sort of white style. And I was like, what does that mean? And then they played him and I was like, oh, that's exactly what that sounds like.
Apparently, my friends have seen him in concert, Southside Johnny, and they say he's one of the best frontmen ever. And he was as popular in that area as Springsteen was in the East Street Band, like two band leaders leading their huge bands and just giving it all every night. Very, very influential on Jon Bon Jovi.
Yes. Number one, I listened for 10 seconds. That's the clip they had. And I was like, I want to know more about this guy. Number two, you buried the lead, you bastard. I was going to mention Bruce Springsteen. Secondly, was not just an influence like the boss would have been for so many musicians in the 70s and 80s, but he says, Jon Bon Jovi says in this documentary, this is sort of the more interesting part of it for me. He's talking about it made being a rock star feel attainable because he also loved Led Zeppelin and Queen, but that was like so far reaching in a way, I could never do what they do. But then you have Bruce Springsteen and he's right there. He's like 20 minutes away from him. They can see him a number of nights a week. They can sneak in and catch this band and just be like, oh my God. And he was already becoming a star and Jon Bon Jovi was able to see him quite a lot. I love that idea that these other Bad Company, Elton John, Zeppelin, they're all larger than life and they're just posters on your wall. That's all they are. It's the only way you can really connect with them. But Southside Johnny and Bruce Springsteen, even though they were making albums, they were also childhood heroes and they were like 25 miles south of his house and he could go see them in these bars. So it made something fictional feel real. He was saying you can go out and you could talk to them, you could touch them. Probably not touch. I don't know if they like that, but you could watch them.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And I didn't realize till I watched the documentary that Jon Bon Jovi became good friends with Bruce Springsteen at that time.
A very nice relationship. Yeah.
And they still talk all the time. In the last episode of the series, they say they just go for drives. They'll just get together, just drive. No destination in mind, just get two guys behind the wheel, no music, nothing.
That better be a tinted car in Jersey. I'll just say that. Because imagine how many people, I think I just saw Jon Bon Jovi in the bar. Hey, trying to like cut them off to make sure. Yeah. Tinted windows, folks. That's the advice.
That's the life hack from Ali. So Bon Jovi then by himself wrote Runaway. And again, the documentary gets into exactly how he did it, how he recorded it. It's all interesting. But for our purposes, he did this and he basically just started to shop it around. No one was interested from record labels.
11 record labels is what he said he sent the demo to. By the way, I should say this. You said Runaway just casually, but you didn't actually know the song Runaway, Asif, is it?
Runaway, yeah. So Ali was talking to me about it. You were saying it's one of your favorite songs by Bon Jovi, or is it?
It might be my favorite. That style of Bon Jovi was the best. That's the only, he has a self-entitled, his debut album is called Bon Jovi, and that track is called Runaway. That's the only song I know from that album. And then there's another album called 7,800 degrees Fahrenheit, I think. 7,000. Anyway, yeah, something in that space. Very, very hot is what we're saying. There's a couple of songs from that album that I really liked also. I don't know if you know those albums, those tracks.
No. So good point. I never heard of Bon Jovi until Slippery When Wet.
No,
we'll talk about that in a second.
My God, why am I even talking to you?
And Runaway, I only know because I've seen Bon Jovi in concert a few times. The last time was probably at least 10 to 12 years ago. I went with my wife, and Bon Jovi, when he's about to introduce Runaway, he's like, we're going to go back in time, back, when this song was our first hit on the charts, and then he plays Runaway. I'm like, oh, that's a great song. I don't think I ever heard it before till
What about this? What about this? In and out of love. Dun, 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 dun.
No.
Okay, anyway. That's from 7,800 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's another one called The Hardest Part is the Night. I remember that song pretty well.
So just so we're clear about timelines, you had heard about Bon Jovi before Slippery When Wet, correct?
That's my favorite Bon Jovi musical time, actually. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, what the heck? Okay, so you were, because Ali, as you guys may not know, I know we've talked about rap a lot, but in the early to mid 80s, Ali was super into like metal, right? You were a metal
I was,
head?
and I was trying to get more into like heavier metal, but I started with Bon Jovi and Poison and, glam bands or hair metal, whatever you call it, Motley Crue.
Motley
Yeah,
Crue, you were a
Ozzy
Motley
Osbourne.
Crue guy.
I was trying to get into like some really like Iron Maiden for me was like the quintessential amazing band. But your first love, Kiss, Poison, Ozzy, early Ozzy. Like I couldn't shake them off for quite some time.
Yeah, so I only knew about him later, but again, we'll talk about his later albums in a second. So, interestingly, for Runaway, he had the single and it was starting to get airplay because he went to DJs and got DJs to play it.
The loneliest people in the music business, he said. That's who I'm going to hit up. Who's lonely?
Smart. Listen, and one thing you'll get from this documentary is Bon Jovi is one of the most driven people that you'll ever meet. Hard work doesn't guarantee success, but you won't get success like he has without hard work, right?
It's not even, I was going to say borderline obsession. It is obsession. It's obsessive. And, one of our best friends, Q, has always said this, like, we look at obsessiveness as like a negative characteristic, but then the people who achieve true greatness, the Steve Jobs and the Bill Gates and whoever else he mentions, the Elon Musks, whether they be complete knobs or not, whatever your opinion is around some of these people who I've just mentioned, and there's thousands more in fields of sport and whatever, music. It's often people who are crazy obsessed. I think of two of my friends, Steph Tolev and Dave Merhej, are the most obsessive comedians I've ever met and befriended in my life, and they both have incredible careers because of it. They're never fully satisfied with what they're doing. They always want more, go further.
And sports, Michael Jordan, David Beckham, these guys are all similar.
Never heard of them.
They're obsessed. Yeah. Okay, getting back to Jon Bon Jovi. So he now has a single that he got DJs to play and is becoming a hit, but he has no band. So he has to form a band, and that's when he recruits the rest of the band. Alec John Such, Tico Torres, David Bryan, who's probably his oldest friend, who's in the band.
Was going to go to med school, was in first year of med school. Like a good Jewish boy, he says his mother wanted him to be a good Jewish doctor. And then he reached out to him. He's like, I think I got something here. He's like, I'll give it 1 year.
And Ritchie Sambora, who was playing it with a bunch of bands. He had toured with Joe Cocker. He had auditioned for Kiss. Like,
that's huge. That's the biggest band of the time. That's the biggest band in North America at that time. And he was asked to audition. I mean, it's
crazy. So, I mean, very impressive. And of course, these guys are jumping on at an interesting time because it's not like they're just joining a band that's unknown. They're joining a guy who now has a hit single on the radio. And so they can see, okay, there might be money here. And they eventually got manager Doc McGee. You guys might know him from Motley Crue.
And Kiss as well.
There's a whole, was he? I didn't know that. So
and Hootie and the Blowfish, which I don't feel really fits in that category, but I mentioned them for your benefit. I think you're a fan.
Thank you. They had a falling out with Doc McGee later. It goes into in the documentary. We don't have to go into too much detail, but I guess the first two albums for Bon Jovi were okay. And then they did two things. They collaborated with Desmond Child, who is a very famous songwriter. I guarantee you know probably 20 songs by Desmond Child. Extremely well-known songwriter. And Desmond Child helped to co-write many of the hits, the early hits for Bon Jovi. And they also got Bruce Fairbairn to produce. And Bruce Fairbairn, he passed away sadly many years ago, but he was one of the hottest producers. Looks like a super nice guy from the documentary. Very modest. But this is the guy. And of course, the person who was helping produce this album was Bob Rock. And Bob Rock, of course, became a huge producer for Metallica, Motley Crue, many, many others. He's one of the most famous producers on Earth. And Bruce Fairbairn was on his way up and was certainly somebody people were seeking out, but then he passed away. And of course, these guys were both Canadian, and the album was recorded in Vancouver. In Bruce Fairbairn's studio. So that was the genesis of Slippery When Wet. So a bunch of things coming together. New producers, new co-writers for the songs, and then now they don't just have a modest hit like Runaway, they have ridiculous breakthrough hits with You Give Love a Bad Name, Living on a Prayer, Wanted Dead or Alive. I mean, these are classic American songs.
Wanted! Right? 1987's top-selling album by Billboard. Yeah, big time. And those are like, you only celebrate them in the karaoke world now, but these are like, you can't.
I mean, they're excellent songs. Yeah. You cannot take away that those songs are just excellent. And it's funny. Ali and I were talking the other day about this connection with Bruce Springsteen. I said it's weird. Bruce Springsteen's never done a collaboration with Bon Jovi for, like, as far as I know. Whereas he's done it with another one of my favorite bands, the Gaslight Anthem. But they're not as well known as Bon Jovi. So how come these two never collaborated? And, well, Ali, why don't you tell them your theory about this?
About why who didn't collaborate with who? Gaslight Anthem?
Bruce Springsteen. Yes. No, Bruce Springsteen did collaborate with lesser bands like the Gaslight Anthem, but he never did a collaboration with Bon Jovi. Right. What is your theory? I'm setting you up again for this since you were confused.
He says on the documentary, Bruce Springsteen says that this was a really hardworking kid. He had something on stage. His stage presence was amazing. And then he made songs that were rock anthems that just begged to be sang by 20,000 kids in an arena. These are a small paraphrasing, because I didn't take the exact quote. I just remember it from watching the documentary. It's a minor paraphrasing on exactly what Bruce Springsteen said. And it struck me in that that's not who Bruce Springsteen is. He's not trying to make rock anthems. As it happens, some of his songs, Born in the USA, can be sang by 1 million people at once in any given city. But I think that was never his goal. I think he's an incredible songwriter and storyteller first and foremost. He's kind of got like this poetic side to him. So I just think that those two songwriting destinations, I guess, don't really match, but there is a mutual respect they have, obviously from John to Bruce, but even from Bruce to John, which is very sweet and beautiful, and they can sort of exist. We do see him on episode 4 bringing the boss on stage to sing with him, and that's kind of cool. But yeah, I think they have this nice healthy divide between their music and their approach to music.
And then, of course, after Slippery When Wet, a few years later, the album was New Jersey, and you have heard many, many songs from this album. I remember when it came out, it was huge. So the hits are Bad Medicine, I'll Be There For You, Born to Be My Baby, Lay Your Hands on Me, Living in Sin. I mean, just so many huge hits from this album.
All of them reached top 10, 2 of them reached top 1. Pretty insane.
And this was like 88. And then
it's 1 year 89. Later. I mean, he was a machine. He was really a songwriting and producing machine.
If you weren't alive during this time, you didn't really know how big this band was. Easily the biggest band in America at the time, in Canada. But of course, what you're saying, Ali, they kept on producing this stuff and touring constantly. And eventually they all burnt out. And by 1991, that's when they had their falling out with Doc McGee, and they had to kind of reevaluate everything. This is a very short period of time. We're talking 4 years, really, right? Since a huge breakout hit with Slippery When Wet, and it was tough for them. And they talk about how they almost broke up. And then during this time as well, Bon Jovi does his solo album for Young Guns, which I think people know, Blaze of Glory. Love that song. Such a great song. And he needed to do that to prove that he could do this on his own. He didn't need the band to write. Then eventually they come back with the greatest hits and Always, the song Always.
I don't care for it as much as
Interesting. It's my wife's favorite song by Bon Jovi. And it was supposed to be from the movie Romeo is Bleeding. Remember
I love that movie, yeah.
Starring Jet Li and Aaliyah.
Ridiculous.
And so he wrote this for it. That's why one of the first lines is Romeo is bleeding, or this Romeo is bleeding. That was their top highest selling single, was Always, if you can believe it. It was huge. And then they kind of proved that, they have staying power. Over time, they released other singles. It's My Life was a huge hit that kind of brought them back to prominence in like 2000. And then what's another one? Have a Nice Day a couple years ago. So, a couple years after that. So they had all these subsequent hits. I would say they never reached the peaks that they had in the 80s and 90s, but they certainly had other peaks. But then, of course, you have to factor in the whole Ritchie Sambora association with Jon Bon Jovi, right? And I thought Ritchie Sambora was just the guitarist, but watching the documentary, you realize he co-wrote a lot of these songs and a lot of these hits. And he sang backup vocals on most of these songs.
Buddy, you were out to lunch, man. They compare Ritchie Sambora and Jon Bon Jovi to Mick and Keith from the Rolling Stones. What is Mick without Keith? Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. Like, that's how they look at it. That's how their fans look at it. These guys were a duo. I have all these images in my head of them leaning against each other's shoulders, singing into the same microphone. Like, yeah, they really were kind of like this inseparable duo. And I never thought that, Ritchie Sambora was replaceable. However.
Well, and and the reason why I know this personally is because we went to go see Bon Jovi. My wife and I have seen them probably 3 or 4 times. And this is probably 2013, 2014, we're seeing them in concert. I'm like, yeah, it's pretty good. I'm like, wait, who is that guitarist? And like, that's not Ritchie Sambora. This guy had like shorter hair. I'm like, what? Who is that guy? And it wasn't mentioned. Like at the very end of the concert, of course, they thank all the band members, but we're like, what? And then I had to like look up to see what happened. So big falling out right there. With Sambora.
It's a very interesting thing. So the guy's name was Phil X. Phil X had filled in 2011 when Ritchie was going through, I think, alcohol rehab. He filled in on a little bit of a tour. And in 2013, Ritchie Sambora just didn't show up. The day of a show, he just didn't show up.
Yeah, it was in Calgary, I believe.
And so he just called him. Jon Bon Jovi called Phil X, said, do you still have the notes? I do. You want to go on tour with us for a little while? Unspecified amount of time. Phil X wound up doing 80 shows the entire tour. The point...
Canadian guy, Phil X, by the way. And now a permanent member of the band.
Yeah. I was watching how... because it's very interesting to me doing the hosting that I do. How do you navigate around awkward things? And it was super interesting to me that Jon Bon Jovi never started any concert with, like, Ritchie's not here. Well, I'll tell you what, we got Phil X on guitar. Because that is possibly setting up Phil X for the worst round, a chorus of booing that he's ever heard in his life. Right? Because he goes, I could feel like the aggressiveness from people like, who is that guy? Just like you yourself described you were like, who is that guy? Imagine you times, 15,000 people all going, who is this guy? So they would do the whole show. And then he would do, I want to thank my buddy Phil X for helping us while Ritchie's away. Never, ever hinting like, here's Ritchie's replacement. Here's the guy who came to our rescue while Ritchie. It's so unbelievably strategic in my mind, the way he did it. Because even Phil X was like 90-minute show and Jon Bon Jovi never addresses me, doesn't even mention my name. All I can feel is the aggressive confusion from fans. And at the end, he goes, I'd like to thank Phil X for helping us out. Just that's all he did. And that might feel a little bit cold and callous, but in fact, I think that's the smartest thing to do for the band and for Phil himself. I found that part of the documentary pretty interesting. I was watching that very keenly. But Ritchie Sambora, brother, I don't know if you remember this. Like, Ritchie Sambora was also connected to Hollywood in a super significant way. Heather Locklear, who I don't know how many of you remember Heather Locklear. She was a huge, huge deal. Melrose Place was, I think, her first famous role. But actually, that's not true. I'm sorry. She was actually, and I had forgotten about that, she was on Dynasty from 1981 to 89, which I don't know anything about Dynasty. But for us, for people our age, if Melrose Place put her on the map, and then in Spin City for a few years. And all that. So she was married to Tommy Lee, 86 to 93, married to Motley Crue's drummer, Tommy Lee.
I forgot about that.
Yes. Before there was Pamela Anderson, there was Heather Locklear. And after a quick divorce, like less than a year, she was with Ritchie Sambora. So this was she was staying in that world, which obviously raises Ritchie Sambora's kind of profile in that world too. People who might not know about him now know about him through that, right? So, and then Heather Locklear had a pretty public mental health issues and different, she checked into mental health facilities, substance abuse issues. And Ritchie Sambora, when he left, it's one of those John Lennon Yoko things like, oh, Heather Locklear broke up the band. I think there was a little bit of that sentiment, but he was, we forget how integral he was to Jon Bon Jovi's life, to this band, and to entertainment at large. And in my mind, I was like, I didn't really enjoy any of Jon Bon Jovi's music after Ritchie Sambora left. And then I did a little bit of a search. I was like, oh, that's incorrect. I didn't like any of their music 13 years before Ritchie Sambora left. So that's it's
mean.
not, look, here's what I'm saying. They were talking about how the rock anthems of their youth didn't make sense. They grew, they became more introspective, they became more thoughtful about the music they were making. It just wasn't for me. It's not them, it's me.
It's true. Obviously, you mature as a singer. And in fact, we're going to talk about that.
I thought you were going to say I mature as a human being, as an audience member. Okay.
No, you don't mature ever. But the subsequent albums, people might remember they did some country stuff. There's a song with Jennifer Nettles that they did. So they kind of were veering into country a bit. And so I can see what you're saying. But yeah, Ritchie Sambora, it's weird watching the documentary because he basically said he had to be at home with his daughter. Obviously, if him and his wife are having issues, the daughter could be
the daughter said to him,
vulnerable.
He also said that his daughter said to him, you got to clean up your act. And it's a young girl saying that to her father. He said that really affected him to hear that from her. And he realized they were together 30 years, man. 30 years, right? Or maybe even a bit more. The band. That's a lot of time, especially we've just talked about the obsessiveness of Jon Bon Jovi. That's a lot of time spent not with family.
Correct. It is interesting that he just didn't show up basically one day.
That's the part that he himself regrets. That's the part that really sours things a little bit. You listen to Jon Bon Jovi's side of the story, you hear about his years of reaction to it afterwards. And it's almost like somebody was broken up with and never told why they were broken up with. That's Jon Bon Jovi. Whereas Ritchie Sambora goes, John knows exactly why I left the band. And other people say, no, he was holding things inside. He was never telling people how he really felt. So he had his own personal breaking point and nobody else was really aware of that. And I've seen this kind of thing before, like communication, folks. Huh? We should have done an episode on communication in our medical topic, by the way.
It's useful. There we go. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018.
Where they deserve to be.
Absolutely. And Sambora did come back and they all played together. They had all the original members back for that. And so that's, I think, the last time they spoke. Like they never really reconciled. That's still a bit of a question mark if that will ever happen again. Bon Jovi clearly is the type of person, you could tell by the documentary, is like, okay, he's gone. We have a replacement. We're moving forward, right? I definitely don't think he looks backwards.
Yes. Publicly and musically, yes. But when he was asked by one of the interviewers, when did you realize that Ritchie's not coming back? And he goes, I don't think I still have. It's been 10 years. I still think about, like, maybe I'll see him again. Maybe we'll work again. Right? So there was that. I don't know if you remember that moment. That's what I mean by it does feel like a guy pining over his ex and being like, I just don't understand why she left me, man. I did everything for that woman. That's my impersonation of that guy.
It's pretty good, yeah.
Thank you. And also, you're mentioning the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. That is for Bon Jovi as a band. Jon Bon Jovi himself also did some acting, and he has also come out into politics, even though he says, like, politics, no, he's never going to get into politics. But I remember he supported Al Gore and Tipper Gore. And I remember that one didn't sit well with me because when you hear Tipper Gore, what does Tipper Gore mean to you, if anything?
Yeah, she was very pro-censorship.
You got it.
Parents Television Council, I think, or something like that. Just that was the whole 80s and 90s. That was Tipper Gore.
That was the whole, I mean, that's her legacy to me. I'm sure she's so much more than that, but it was protect the children. And she's the one who put the warning labels on metal, on heavy, on, like,
and rap.
Of course,
albums.
rap. Yeah, exactly. Of course, rap. But I mean, I was, as a metal fan.
Parental advisory, explicit lyrics.
Parental advisory, exactly. Quiet Riot doesn't need your parental advisory. Now my parents are going to be like, don't listen to this. I'm like, there's nothing. These guys aren't doing anything. They just sing loud and bang their heads. That's all they do. Come on, So this is her legacy for me. And when John was such a big supporter of those two, I was like, that kind of sucks. Like, it feels like the camaraderie that I thought you would have had with fellow musicians isn't there. And it's more like a thing where you're like, well,
Right, but he was more supporting Al Gore in 2000 as the presidential nominee.
He was.
I think because nobody really talks too much anymore about Tipper Gore, and even in 2000 they weren't. But fair enough, fair enough. Okay, you were upset by that.
To your point, it was a decade later, but that's her legacy. And I'm just saying, honestly, I felt a weird feeling about that. He's also talked about, Biden-Harris performing in 2020, he was campaigning for Joe Biden. I don't know if they call it campaigning for, but there's pictures of him rocking out on stage with Pennsylvania for Biden-Harris. He was definitely touring and trying to get people to rally behind Joe Biden. He's very kind of like anti-Trump, and there's been an anti-Bon Jovi campaign by the Trump crew too. Michael Caputo is a political strategist hired by Trump. He started that anti-Bon Jovi campaign. So he lives in that world of politics in a strange way as well. He was trying to buy the Buffalo Bills at one point with some Canadian investors. Yeah, and then it didn't work out. But it's been more interesting to see what else he's trying to do outside of music, because I think, as you see in this special, like, it may be the end.
It may be the end of music for him. Let's talk about this. So you call it special, but you meant the documentary series. It goes back and forth in time, right? It starts with the early history, but it also goes to the present day where he's battling these vocal cord issues. And in 2022, the band started a tour, and he tried a couple shows. And basically, there's lots of stuff on social media saying that his vocal performance is not that good. And I would say even when I saw them in 2013 or 2014 with my wife, I'm like, he's not able to hit the notes the same way.
10 years ago. So there's a clip of him in studio. Back in the studio he started performing in, and he says to Obi, I think Mike O'Brien, what original producer on the albums and all that, guy he loves to death. He says, I've got a few regrets in my life, and that chord change is one of them. And Obi goes, hey, I was at Philadelphia Eagles game or something, and 20,000 fans were singing along to that song. And John goes, they weren't hitting that note, but his regret is that he made the song, he didn't need to make the song that way where...
Yeah, it was living on a prayer. And there's a chord change in the very last part of the song.
It's so crazy.
And it's just crazy. And he's known for that, right? The chord changes. My wife and her sister always talk about it, like the chord changes that he's known for. So, and we're going to talk about chord changes, vocal chord changes in our second half. But before we get to that, Ali, what do you think of this documentary? You said you had some comments, so we'll wrap up this section with your thoughts on the documentary.
I didn't like it that much. And I was a Bon Jovi fan for like half the career of Bon Jovi. I didn't enjoy it that much. I felt it dragged on a little bit. I felt like if I had nothing else to do, it's a great Sunday afternoon kind of like just kill some time. Mm-hmm. But I was like, are we working towards an end here? What's happening? This is like back and forth, back and forth. I'm not convinced that this was a strong documentary. I have to read some reviews about it to see what people thought, but I really felt like this thing is really kind of maybe not going in circles, but I don't understand where it's going and where it's moving to.
Interesting. Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I'll defend it a bit more. I do think it's 4 hours. It could be 2 hours. I do feel that's the case. But the best documentaries are not really what you think they're about, right?
Yes.
And they're actually about something else. So this is, in theory, it's about Bon Jovi and the career and the band and their falling out. And it is about that. But it's actually about getting older. And it's about the hands of time and time marching on, and you sometimes being helpless to do anything about it. And when you think about it like that, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah. I think by the end, I was like, this is more of a career retrospective to me than it's anything else. And then I was picking out things that I enjoyed, but there's a lot of forgettable parts about it, which speaks to the fact that it could have been half the time, half the length. But if you're a big Bon Jovi fan, you will like this special, I believe.
Correct.
Or if you want to, if you're interested in knowing more about Bon Jovi and the world of these, arena selling out, world touring bands, I think there's a lot of stuff that's interesting.
Yeah, I think unless you're the most hardcore fan, there's a lot of stuff here you've never heard before, unless you're obsessed with them and read all the biographies and stuff. But if not, you're going to see a lot of very, very interesting new things. But why don't we segue then, Ali, and talk about the vocal cord issues that take up a lot of this documentary? Sound good?
You got it, buddy. So, as you mentioned, Asif, 2022, the band announced a tour. Critics, meaning actual critics who make money and then social media losers, said that the quality of his vocal performances during that tour was poor. Now, you said you felt that in 2014. So imagine 8 years later, what's been so I think people had these questions. He says he began experiencing issues in 2015. You would probably say a year earlier.
No, it's 2014.
Exactly,
anyway, I'm just joking,
exactly.
But maybe it was 2015. I don't remember.
Yeah. So let's talk about what this condition is that he has, because, he's talked about this vocal cord surgery. What happened to his vocal cords? Is it because he's a singer? Is this something that can happen to anybody? Is this something that has warning signs that you should be aware about? These are the kind of questions I have around this. So feel free to back up and start from the beginning. Maybe even let's talk about what are vocal cords and what do we do before we start talking about how do we take care of them or how things can go wrong.
For sure. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. One interesting point, by the way, about Bon Jovi is that his wife comes off very well in this documentary. She seems like a very normal person.
Super supportive.
But she basically told him in 2022 after some of these shows, she's like, he said he had a devastating conversation with his wife, and it sounds like she was pretty blunt. Like, you don't have it.
Took her 7 years to have that conversation, but anyway, that's nice.
She said, and he realized he had to either seek medical help or retire. And he says it in the documentary, he doesn't want to be doing 100% of 80%. He can try as hard as he can, but if he can only get to 80% of what he was before, that's not Bon Jovi, and he can't do it. So, and the documentary goes through a bunch of different ways he tries to help his vocal cords. But you're right, Ellie, we should probably back up a second. So our voice is produced in our voice box, which is our larynx, right, in our throat. And it houses in the larynx these two vocal folds. They're not called vocal cords, actually. They're called vocal folds. So we have two of these, and they oppose each other. So sometimes they can be in the open position. Sometimes they can be in the closed position. And
like if you eat some scallops that you're allergic to, then they go into the closed position and you almost choke and die?
Yeah, that's a different sort of situation. So they're kind of connected at the front and they're more open at the back. So it's like a little triangle. And the back part where they're open is...
Triangle, so you're saying if you're looking down, if you were looking from the top down...
If you're looking down, there'll be a tip where it's more fused and then a part where they're more open. And that open area is the glottis. And the glottis is what, when it's open, you allow airflow to go in and out of your lungs. And when it's closed, you won't have any air passing through. But as you bring the cords, see what I did there? As you bring the folds together, right? And air comes out, that's how you're producing sounds. Okay? So if you can't bring the vocal cords together completely, they will vibrate, okay? And that produces a sort of breathy voice quality. And that's part of the issue of what happens as you get older. So essentially, what's going on with Jon Bon Jovi is he has a condition called vocal fold atrophy or presbylaryngis. And I may be pronouncing that incorrectly because I never heard of this until I saw the documentary. So as we age, all of our muscles atrophy. We know that over time. And the vocal cords obviously have muscles in them as part of these vocal folds.
So this is actually one of the more interesting things here because atrophy, a layperson like myself, associates it with muscle disuse. You stop using your muscles, they begin to atrophy. Whereas Bon Jovi does the exact opposite. He keeps his vocal cords or folds in constant use as a singer. So that was also an interesting part of this. Like, why would he have this atrophying?
Right. And we could talk in general, we do lose muscle as you get older. That's a phenomenon called sarcopenia.
Not me, bro.
Look at this guy. He's flexing right now in case you can't tell. So, and maybe that's a good idea for another episode to talk about why that happens and why it's so important to even just try and maintain your musculature if you can. But even if you try to do that, and as you said, he does use his voice all the time, you can end up having this issue. So basically, he's having this issue where it's getting difficult to oppose the vocal cords. And that's causing him to not be able to achieve the same sounds as before. So he has difficulty adducting. Adducting is bringing something together. So he has difficulty kind of doing that. So it is a normal phenomenon, but this is why some singers, especially male singers, their voice just is not the same as they get older.
I have felt the same, my friend. I've felt it myself.
Oh yeah, we forgot to say this. Ali, of course, were you in more than one band or just one
Just
band?
one band. The band broke up though, Asif. A little bit of bad news.
Why is that?
I was in a band. We jammed about, I'm going to say 8 to 10 times. We were in my friend's kind of music studio. He built a music studio above his parents' house. He was a friend of one of my buddies. He's a cousin. He's a cousin of one of my buddies, and I've known him since I was a kid. I love this guy. We jam a bunch of times, and then this guy, his best friend from high school, who's also in the band, says, I got us a gig. It's on the West Island of Montreal. We're going to open for like 2-3 bands. It's going to be like, we'll do a 15, 20-minute set. And in that moment, our buddy, who has created a music studio, has all the equipment, has drums, multiple guitars, bass, tells us he has a paralyzing fear of performing live.
Can
you believe it? It's a ridiculous story. It's ridiculous. It sounds insane when I say it out loud.
Okay.
So we were like, so what's the goal here? He's like, I don't know. I just like jamming with you guys and eating chips, and I like smoking a joint and playing guitar. We were like, oh, okay, we were hoping to do more. And then so it just ended there. He had the equipment, he had the space. So to move without him felt weird, but we would have done it. But now you're like, we need kits, we need a van, because he had everything set up. So it was just too much of a commitment. And the band broke up. What could have been, bro? What could have been?
Well, this is all very, very interesting.
What I'm saying is that I used to be able to sing 25 songs, let's say, confidently, and I had this repertoire. That has gone down to maybe 10. I just don't practice the singing is what I thought the issue was. But also, I barely had a range to begin with, and I have less of a range now. It's terrible.
We'll talk about some things that people can do for their vocal fold health, but let's save that for the end, because we should talk about what Bon Jovi did. So there are two kind of treatments for this. You can obviously do some speech therapy to try and do exercise to help oppose your vocal folds better, but some patients are going to need to do surgery for that. So one procedure is one where you basically inject fat or some other material into the vocal folds, because I think for Bon Jovi, he said one of them was actually smaller than the other. He had some asymmetry between his vocal folds. I think he says that in the either in the documentary or some of the articles that he was interviewed about this documentary, which we'll link to.
And is that uncommon?
No, I think it's pretty common with what's going on. So you may want to inject something, whether it's fat or another filler, into the other vocal cords to help them oppose. But then sometimes you need to get an actual surgery, which is medialization laryngoplasty, where you put an implant into the vocal cords to permanently displace them. So it displaces the vocal folds. Sorry, I'm using vocal folds and cords interchangeably here.
I feel like our listeners would forgive you, and I think they would be more angry for you correcting yourself 9,000 times.
Sorry about that. But it allows them, it just pushes the vocal folds closer to the midline, so allows them to oppose better. And so, I mean, spoiler for the documentary, you can just look this up online. He did have the surgery, and in the documentary, he's still recovering from it. That's probably another reason why the documentary, maybe Ali didn't like it, is because it's inconclusive. Like, did this work? Yeah. He's still recovering from it, so we don't know whether
it felt like the director might have started this hoping that by the time we wrap up, we'll have we'll have a conclusion. But I guess it was like, oh no, it's going to be a long time till we figure this out. So he was just like, let's just get this out instead. It felt like
that's what it felt like. Yeah.
We should also mention that he's doing a lot of stuff in the documentary, kind of instead of the surgery, or in anticipation or around, right? He's got these lasers on his throat. He's got these 3 different, probably the world's best vocal coaches that he's doing vocal warm-ups and cool downs with. And you get a feeling for how much hard work this guy's willing to put in. This is not like a 10-minute stretch before you go on a run. This is like an insane amount of work he's putting in, and he's exhausted after this, what basically seems like extended sort of physiotherapy, massage therapy, laser therapy for his throat, you know?
Yeah. I think it speaks more to there's no easy solution to this other than doing something invasive like the surgery. So he's trying everything he can do, you know, without having to resort to that, because it is scary, right? I mean, he makes money in theory from his voice, and it could be permanently damaged or whatever.
I mean, he hasn't needed an extra nickel since 1995. But yes, I understand your point. Yeah. So we're talking about vocal cord injury broadly in this episode. There's that one type, which you don't know if you pronounced correctly, presbylaryngis. That's Bon Jovi's thing. What other ones do we know about?
I mean, the main thing is with what you hear about vocal cord injuries, right? When you hear about a singer having vocal cord injury, or someone becoming hoarse with their voice, you know, after screaming a lot. And sometimes those can lead to things, different kinds of lesions on the vocal folds, and most commonly these are vocal fold nodules. So our vocal folds are very resistant, you know, but if someone does something like screaming very loudly or excessive talking, singing, screaming at a concert, say you're, you know, Ali, when you're fanboying out at Iron Maiden or Metallica, then you can have injury. So then you'll get inflammation of the vocal folds, and that's going to affect your voice. That's why the voice becomes hoarse, and you have this inflammatory response. If you have things going on for a longer period of time, such as singers, then you can get permanent lesions like vocal nodules. And these are benign growths, so they're not cancerous growths, but they can appear on the vocal folds. And they're observed commonly in women aged 20 to 50, but sometimes they can be seen in young children, actually, especially little kids who are screaming a lot or shouting a lot. Yeah. They will present to their doctors with a change in their voice quality. So obviously, the first thing you want to know is, could you have an infection, right? Do you have a laryngitis? Do you have a sore throat, strep throat, something like that? That would be an obvious thing. But if not, and it's persistent, and you may want to see a doctor, and of course, then it's usually an ear, nose, and throat specialist who would actually look at your larynx to see, using a scope to see, okay, is there evidence of injury, such as one of these nodules? And it's interesting, the issues are more likely in females because men speak at about 100 to 140 hertz. So that's the number of times per second their cords collide with each other. So it means hertz means cycles per second. So it means 100 to 140 times per second your vocal cords are colliding with each other when you're talking. So very frequently. But for women, they speak at 180 to 240 hertz. So it's like almost double the amount. So they have more collisions per second, so they're going to have more risk of vocal cord injuries. And there's famous people who've had vocal cord nodules. So Julie Andrews, very interesting, in 1997, she had a surgery to remove nodules from her vocal folds, and that left her voice scratchy and irreparable. And she had a medical malpractice suit, but that was a long time ago. So now the surgery is not as risky, and so a lot of people get turned off by this Julie Andrews story. I always wondered why she stopped singing, and I heard her, I heard her the most recently? She plays like Gru's mother in Despicable Me, like those movies. And I'm like, why does she sound like that? I mean, she's doing a voice in it, but she does sound like an elderly woman now. That was a reason. And now they can do a lot of these surgeries much more easily.
I think she is an elderly woman now also. That's the other thing.
Oh, that could be the reason. Yeah, I guess. But she probably sounded like an elderly woman in 1997, which would have been crazy. So, if you have these vocal nodules, then you can have surgery. But now they do it with laser. The recovery is much, much quicker. But The problem is not the surgery, because the surgery is minor, and we'll link to some articles talking about that. There's this ear, nose, and throat surgeon with the last name Zetels, who is like interviewed in every single article about famous people and vocal folds and vocal cords. He's the guru in this. He says it's not the surgery that's an issue; it's the recovery, because they recommend, and I think Bon Jovi had to do this even for his procedure, absolute voice rest for 2 or 3 weeks, no talking. For 2 or 3 weeks. That's it.
Monk, vow of silence
people
vibes.
Or whatever, right? And then he slowly lets people start talking, and then singing is roughly at 4 weeks. For Bon Jovi in the documentary, it was about a bit longer. It was a couple months before he was able to start singing. So there is other things that people can do if they're developing these vocal nodules. Obviously, seeing a speech language therapist to do vocal exercises may help and prevent you from developing them in the future. But like I said, there is treatment for these if people have them. And even if they have surgery, the recovery period is a bit brutal, but the surgery itself has relatively low risk compared to how it was many years ago.
So low risk, but that's of complications. But what about bringing your, what is that called? Success, rate of success. What is that like?
Yeah, for the nodules, like it's pretty common. Lots of famous singers had them. I think that success is pretty good. I think it's a bit more questionable for what Bon Jovi had in terms of whether it's going to, it may improve your vocal quality, but will you get back to where you were before? That's the real question, right? Like, how much can you reverse this natural aging? That's the question. That's why I got that out of the documentary. It's really about, your body's getting older, and how do you deal with that? I mean, he's otherwise in great shape. I mean, the guy looks amazing.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure for what he had, what the outcome's going to be.
Okay. So let me borrow a term from the world of sleep and ask you about vocal hygiene. What are the tips for vocal hygiene?
Yeah. So it's important to, I think, make sure for tips to keep your voice healthy, that you go to the right source. So I found a nice article from a speech language pathologist. So again, you go to the experts on this, not like people making up stuff that's not evidence-based. So number one thing, and so we see Ali does this, right? Because even though we do a podcast together, Ali is on the radio much more than I am, and he's on TV shows, etc. He was in a band, so he uses his voice all the time. In fact, he's a stand-up comedian, so his voice is his livelihood. Maybe he should get it insured through Lloyd's of London. We should talk about that
We should be sponsored by Lloyd's of London after that.
Yeah, there we go. So number one thing for vocal health, hydration. So Ali, how are you with that?
Don't mind if I do.
Oh, he's got a water bottle right there, having a drink. Hydration, almost to keep super hydrated if you're someone who uses their voice all the time. So public speakers, singers, etc. People on the radio like Ali. And so do you try and do that when you're on the radio, when you're recording?
A ton, man. A ton. I feel a little bit like I've lost my wallet if I go into a studio or wallet. That's like a 1938 reference. It feels like I've lost my phone, for example. You know what I mean? If I don't have water there and I'm going to be in a studio for longer than half an hour, I'm like, I'm sorry. Can I just go get a cup of water? I forgot. Yeah. It has to be around.
Oh, really? Yeah. You pause it
and sometimes I won't need a ton of it, but just to have it there. But I also feel like, now, listen, I probably drink more beer and I have coffee and the occasional Guru energy drink, so maybe I need it. But this is an episode in itself, I get a lot of leg cramping more than anybody else I know. So my body tells me when I'm dehydrated. So I think I've always been a guy who, since I was a teenager, drinking a lot of water. Like my wife will go to sleep, no water. At night, no water. During the night, no water in the morning. Just slowly gets to it by like 10 a.m., which to me, that is inconceivable that you would go 12 hours without having water. I have water at night. I have it by the bed. I have it immediately when I wake up, and then I have it throughout the day. So,
yeah, I used to have it by the bed too, and then I'd get up and knock it over by accident like a million times. And
it doesn't have to be an open glass. The technology exists now for covered cups. And
Interesting. Okay, moving on. Number 2 suggestion: warm up and cool down your voice. Okay, they give an example. An easy warm up: you take a straw between your lips, and in the air and a cup of water, you make a U sound.
I saw Bon Jovi doing that.
And then for 5 minutes, you change the pitch and frequency of making the sound. The resistance to the straw is the key, because it kind of gives your vocal chords, vocal folds, a warm-up. Do you do these warm-up and cool-down exercises?
I do not.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay, well, and especially I think if people are professional singers, I read about a lot of these singers after a concert. I read about, what's his name? I read about Axl Rose. He would, someone wanted to talk to him after the concert, but he's just in the shower doing vocal cool downs for half an hour to an hour after every
okay.
And apparently these singers have to do this. It's like, that's how they maintain. So as we were kind of saying, the comparison is like working out, right? You can't just go start sprinting immediately. You have to warm up before you exercise. Or you can't just go and start using weights immediately. You got to warm up beforehand. So this is the same thing. So warming up and cooling down, very important.
The message here that I'm getting, the big takeaway is let your children be guitar players instead of leaders of the band.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then we'll have to talk about the repetitive strain injury
fingers.
What else? Watch lifestyle factors. So these are things we've talked about before: balanced diet, periods of rest, sleep, and then things like cigarettes, alcohol, caffeine, soft drinks.
Keith Richards obviously laughing from the grave that he is not.
That's right. Though I don't think he's considered to be the best singer in the world. But and a lot of the reasons for these is not just to say, oh, these are bad for you. It's because of acid reflux. A lot of association between acid reflux disease, because if acid reflux comes out of your stomach and goes back up your esophagus, it could go all the way up to your vocal cords, right? And affect that. That's a common thing that singers can have an issue with. Number 4 recommendation, listen to your body. If you're finding that your throat is sore, if you have vocal fatigue, a cracking in your voice, unusual pitch in your voice, then it means something's wrong. And again, you could be sick. Maybe you need to go to the doctor to get checked out, or maybe you need to rest, because singing itself shouldn't have any negative symptoms associated with it. One thing interesting they say in this is things like tea with honey or lemon or ginger or gargling with salt water don't fix your voice. So I know a lot of people think that, so they don't have any effect on the vocal folds. So that's not necessarily recommended by speech pathologists. And the most important thing, number 5, if you're having pain, changing your voice that's going on for a long period of time, there's no obvious infection, you should visit a speech therapist, which we call a speech language pathologist, or an ear, nose, and throat doctor, also called an ENT doctor, or otolaryngologist, and they can make sure that there's nothing going on. And of course, a speech therapist can give you exercises to help practice.
I do vehemently disagree with one point here about gargling with salt water doesn't work. And you know who else disagrees with that, Asif?
My dad.
Your father, exactly. The original, the OG gargler. I can't think of anything that is more beneficial for my throat when I feel something coming on, or when I feel even like just some sort of tickle or irritation in the throat. Nothing works as consistently.
Right. I think what we're talking about, does like gargling get down to your vocal folds?
It may not.
And it does not. It's not possible, because if you have water down there and you're opening and closing your glottis, exactly, you're going to aspirate that. It's going to go into your lungs. Exactly. So I think that's the point. So does it make you feel better? Maybe, but it's probably not going to help your voice.
Vocal fold specifically. Gotcha. Okay.
So that's our episode for today. Let us know what you guys thought about our discussion about Jon Bon Jovi and his band Bon Jovi. Did you guys like it? Did you guys not like it?
Did we leave anything out? Is there more you wanted to hear about Jon Bon Jovi being an incredible sex symbol for most of his life?
And of course, for example, his son is now engaged to Millie Bobby Brown from Stranger Things. That's it. Well, you didn't touch on that, but it's not really relevant to Jon Bon Jovi's life. But let us know what you guys thought about that, as well as our discussion about vocal cord injury. Were you upset that I interchangeably used vocal folds and vocal cords? Let us know. drvcomedian@gmail.com, Dr. V Comedian on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are everywhere. Ali, anything going on for June?
A lot of comedy here and there, smaller shows as I ramp up for a bigger show in September. But the website, standupali.com, if there's anything that I can share, it'll be there, or Stand Up Ali on Instagram.
But listen, guys, You can check that out, but I want you to remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye. Bye.